and this video is going to be about the narrative of the state superstructure and how we have to get over it. Sometimes these videos are cathartic. Now, state superstructure I also call a propaganda matrix, which means it has a narrative, and while the state superstructure means many aspects to it, I obviously quite often focus on the open world part of it because that propaganda needs to be gone completely. Eventually our task is to ignore this thing, but we have to get over it in our own minds first, otherwise it's not really being ignored. There's no point trying to trick ourselves. That doesn't work. Some people might be able to trick their own minds, I can't. Now, it needs to be ignored because it's manipulative towards us. They're energy vipers. I'm reading my own notes here. So it's ignore, ignore, ignore. We build our own community fields of knowledge online that have seen through the past. I mean, for example, if we look away from the state, what is usually thought of as state superstructure stuff, if we look at something like UFOs, there's some people in that community, that UAP or UFO field, that want the state to confess it all completely, 100%. And other people say, oh, that will never happen, so we've got to do our work ourselves. Now, the Harvard physicist, one of the leading physicists in the world, Nobel Prize winning, all that sort of stuff, Avi Loeb, he's one of those who's really super smart, so he can say, I'll do the science myself and disclose this myself if I get any evidence. Now, while 99.9999999% of us are not Nobel Prize winning Stanford or Cambridge or Oxford or Princeton educated, they can nevertheless at least follow that. I browsed one peer-reviewed paper they've done, and it's not beyond comprehension, but then again, it was kind of boring, so I can understand why some people just want the disclosure thing from the government, from the state. But my point there is there's that way of doing it, or there's the Abbey Road way. Now, my thing about beyond UFOs, but in other words, more stuff, the state will never, ever, ever deliver. It will. The world has got more educated in the West. It's got more cynical. It's for example, millennials, 16 to 40-year-olds, I think they are. So about 18 to 40, whatever. They're the first ever generation in history to not get more right wing as they get older. Now, this obvious way, that's YouGov. Sorry, yeah, YouGov, that's right. The reason for this is obvious because of the internet. It's so cynical that in the past people would just give up. I noticed the Brexit referendum was the first time ever I saw people not give up on both sides. Now, we in the UK, I don't usually think the UK influences the US, but I think that's what happened then. Trump thought, I'm going to do all this divide and rule, don't give a crap about truth, and all that kind of stuff. And I'm positive that he thought of doing this because of Brexit, because it went to a post-truth world, basically. Sounds pedantic, that, but it's true. It's true that it was post-truth. Now, and since then the state has been suffering badly because it might give you short-term gain being post-truth, but long-term it's destroying. It destroys yourself. And I'm glad they're doing that for that reason. I don't want them to become sensible now, because there's always the opportunity of going back to being unsensible again and just screwing with us again. So it's best that they just get all the stuff out of the system like they are doing. I like this quote by Caitlin Johnston. People who've escaped psychologically abusive relationships tend to have a much better understanding of propaganda than people who haven't, and tend to have a lot more sympathy for the victims of propaganda brainwashing. I just like that quote. There must be some link. I want to get to the propaganda matrix and a gist of how it works. Now, I've been looking into this for ages now. So there's just a gist of how it works. It's very smart, but vastly immoral science. Some of its key features include emissions propaganda. Now, this is where they set the agenda in a way, and it's in the news media or the press or whatever, and they never ever ever mention alternatives that they know exist, ever, forever. I mean literally forever. And an example of this would be seen through the empire of which the US is, never be discussed ever. So, or could you imagine a right-wing paper thinking about your alternative to capitalism? This won't ever do it. It's a similar how they won't ever admit their sales decline. Anyway, so that's emissions propaganda. There's divide and rule, which is the most commonly known, I think. The deflecting when they do that with culture war, Brexit. Then there's herding. It's like the sheepdog herd sheep. This is confusing now because of realignment, but they tried to herd people into cages of Republican, Democrat, Labour, but it's all messed up now. But they still do it in a way. There's still only these cages that exist. Now the ones that won't be herded, so what they think. Now the next thing for the propaganda matrix is fake conflict at the top. This is where they pretend to hate each other's guts, whereas really they don't. You just have to go to Parliament and you see that. So that one is actually can be visibly seen through. But yeah, the kind of, I'm not saying there's no one at the top that doesn't hate, but it's not generally true. I mean, most things are relatively true and relatively false. I tend to deal with a relatively true and relatively false. And the next thing is megaphone agenda setting 24/7 repetition forever. That's propaganda as well. The brainwashing is so extensive that debate shows on TV discussing issues of the day, centred around everyday people doing most of the talking, thus appearing democratic and not democratic because it's the propaganda matrix. That's the dog. Because it's the propaganda matrix that set the agenda, being discussed using the above methods. I just said that's a dog, didn't I? I think you know that. Not the cat. Anyway. Now I'll just read a few Caitlin Johnston quotes. This is on herding that I just mentioned. You see people herded into both mainstream political factions over and over again with this stuff they keep hammering day after day after day, therefore bolstering the power structure the parties which represent those factions are designed to support. They do it because it works. Another one is from her, she's an Australian journalist by the way, but a very radical one and unique one. Not exactly Rupert Murdoch's wife. Another one is, if the culture war looks like a psyop to you, a psychological operation that is, it's because it is. I've seen some people calling it a distraction. and to be sure, it serves the powerful to keep everyone arguing about subjects that threaten the powerful in no way, but it actually goes a lot further than that. Another quote from her. She's Australian, but when she refers to parties, she's tending to mean the Republicans and Democrats. There's a few reasons for this. One, because she sees America as the empire. Another one is probably because she's speaking to Americans at most of the time. Anyway, both parties are engineered to support the depravity of the empire. I mentioned empire there. If you think one is better, more truthful, or less propaganda-laden than the other, that just means you're being herded by the propaganda in the way described above. She would agree with me that there isn't really parties, they're just party. Yeah, because they're serving the state superstructure. That's their job. Admissions are as important as this, but I don't want to read everything out that she's written, so I'm going to read a bit more of the herding from her. She says, on ideological herding, she says, populations put into two mainstream factions of relatively equal size, which both prevent all meaningful change and serve the interests of the powerful. Indeed. Anyone who can't be herded into either of these mainstream factions is instead herded into fake populist factions, which eventually corral them back into the mainstream factions. Now, I'll explain this bit what she's saying. She's saying the anti-establishment parties really aren't anti-establishment, lying, and if you start supporting them, they'll just want power, and if they've got any, you just be back in, and if they don't get any, you're just outside of the herding until that party dies, and then you have to go back to one. Always reforms, propaganda, superstructure always exists, and yeah, I mean, like when you think about anti-establishment parties, well, they're in the system, right? So they're lying even in plain sight. I mean, proper anti-establishment would mean that you're not playing within the system. If you're playing within the system, you're propping it up. It doesn't make any sense, but people just hear the words and don't think about that sometimes. I mean, like, I give my example. There's other examples than this, obviously, but my favourite example is Lennon and Yoko Ono. And they're anti-establishment, so they're not trying to win within the system. They're being consistent and honest. Whereas, I don't know, it could give a left or right example. So I'm going to give a right example. Don't mean to say that that there's no lefties, like there are. But a right-wing example of a liar would be like Marine Le Pen or her dad, because they're playing the system while claiming to be anti the whole system. They don't qualify words. They say we hate the whole lot of it, can't stand it, all that. They talk like that. They're playing the system. They claim to be revolutionaries, but they're not. They're standing in democratic elections from even in their own words. It doesn't make any sense to me. It's like saying you hate football and playing football every week. It's just mad. I don't get it. Yeah, getting back to her quote, where she says that people who can't be herded into either of these mainstream factions is herded into fake populist factions. Well, you see, even the voters there are being fools, aren't they? Because they're thinking they're outside the system. And they say these anti-established cliche all the time, yet they're not. But anyway, so they're corralled back into the mainstream faction. Those few politically engaged people who can't be herded to any of these groups, and now she's talking about the real anti-establishment, are so small in number that they can simply be marginalised and denied any sizeable platform. Until they're wanted years later, and then all the politicians say, why were they neglected? Because they're saying that now because they're voting for them, and they pretend that they were always on their side. You know, it's so repetitive and boring to see through. And by the way, those who stand up for them years later are just playing the same game. They'll probably marginalise some others somewhere at the same time they're saying that. So divide and rule. And anyway, getting back to her quote, because I keep interrupting it. So I'll get back. I'll just say again, those few politically engaged people who can't be herded towards any of these groups are so small in number at any one time that they can simply be marginalised and denied any sizable platform from which to spread their ideas. And democracy does the rest because the majority are supporting the status quo. Yeah, and Caitlin would admit that the majority don't say they're supporting the status quo because they don't think they are, but they are. I write here that it's so disheartening that so many people consume the news media despite hating the news media, when the news media is the key part of the propaganda matrix problem in the first place. And yet so many people consume it in an effort to find the solution to the problem. Weird, because that news media is at least part of the problem. It's like trying to empower your abuser to work in the interests of the abused everywhere. Then we wonder why we dislike them so much. It's because they are the problem, so we should not feed the problem. Get rid of the problem instead. That makes more sense. I write here, we should all criticise our own side until there are no sides. I'm going to say more on this sort of stuff in a minute as well. It goes further than what I'm saying here. So Labour criticise Labour, Tory criticise Tory, Lib Dem criticise Lib Dem, Republican criticise Republican, Democrat criticise Democrat, US criticise US, China criticise China, Russia criticise Russia. You've got the message. After all, they're all part and parcel of state superstructures that are alike. They're not alien to each other, as opposed to different to one another. One of those nations that accuses... So let's imagine there's a nation that accuses another nation of being murderous. Well, that's akin to Myra Hindley lecturing Jack the Ripper on the principle of non-violence. It's just hypocritical, really. And to continue the theme of serial killing, I do think that if any of those nations, and I could add the UK, was a person, then it would be a serial killer that used his or her brain to escape capture. Because I don't deny that this science of propaganda and power and control is effective, relatively. It's getting less effective because of the internet. But anyway, he or she would come across like butter wouldn't melt, possess good PR, and convince some that he or she's not narcissistic, rather they're a decent guy or gal. She would get a whole load of thickos to defend his or her character, and even to identify with it, to the bewilderment of many others who see through the narcissistic serial killer. Now, that was, I just checked my notes. What about? Yeah, I want to get back to what I was saying when I was going on about how we should criticise our own side. Well, eventually, therefore, like I say in the first sentence, I put, I can't read, it's too blurry video, but in the first sentence, you can play it back to check me out. We should all criticise our own side until there are no sides. But I want to circle that for myself there, no sides, because that is key. Because this whole game is about dividing and rule, superiority, inferiority. Now, some people associate this divide and rule, superiority, inferiority with the right wing, but the left do this as well. The difference is, some the right are honest about it. Most aren't, but some are. I mean, obviously, and then you've got the Liberals. Now Liberals are such a broad category, even within the game, because you've got like Cameron, Osborne, Clegg. I mean, Clegg's in a different party to Cameron Osborne, the same sort of thing. Major, same sort of thing, and lots of Labour MPs like that. Now they're on this. They're like capitalists, and they're all they're doing superiority, inferiority in general, power and inequality, income and inequality. They're doing all that, but they're letting, they're thinking that like being homophobic or something's wrong. It is wrong, but just because they're socially liberal on something like that, on race, doesn't mean to say they're not dealing in vast power and control, power inequality. I mean, so like we see more clearly at times, I think, the brazen like fascism of the far right, but don't see the similar thing with the Liberals that are totally and utterly presiding over something very similar. I mean, like, I don't think that the UK would be much more socially liberal if there was a Liberal Democrat government, or if it was much. I don't think it was much more liberal when there was a Cameron, Clegg, Tory. So it's like the main thing is the vast state superstructure. It's far more important. It's far more important. I mean, it's far more important. So long as there isn't something like an extreme, like vicious homophobia, like there probably was 70s and 80s. But I mean, like now the state superstructure is vastly more important, so it can be considered one thing, and to distinguish between too much between the likes of Cameron and the present Tory government is ridiculous, because it's not that much different. So it's the state superstructure is more important than that little bit of prejudice that you can point to. So I don't find any problem with saying that we can get rid of these labels, like Labour, Tory, Lib Dem, and just replace it with the state superstructure. That would be far more clarifying, because it gets over their games of dividing everything up and pretending there's such a vast difference. I'm not saying there is absolutely no difference, but I'm saying it's close to that. It's close to absolutely no difference. So I'm like 98% truthful by saying it's all one thing, whereas they're 2% truthful. That's the thing. And therefore, like I say, there isn't much difference between any government. It's cliche to say that, so I have to explain and nail it down why I'm saying that. Because the difference is not whether one party is a little bit more prejudiced than another on something like homophobia. The difference is that there's no difference on the state superstructure, where there's vast inequality of power and income. Vast. It's the difference isn't that little bit of prejudice about social liberalism. The difference is on between the people that have no power and these megaphones can reach millions, and the state that backs that up. That's the massive difference. That's why if you looked at something like Marxism, there would be a footnote on homophobia where there'd be massive amounts on the ownership and wealth and megaphone corporations that are billions of dollars and multinational. It'll be all about that. That's because they know what they're talking about, The culture wars are like a little tiny grain of sand compared to that. That's not to say that no one ever experiences any prejudice. It's to say that there is a vastly bigger thing. You just for the power and control inequality on how much power someone has with their voice or with money, you just have to look to your next door neighbour. Whereas someone experiencing homophobia would have to go looking for them, because meaning it's not that common anymore. So I would understand putting the focus on that if it was the 70s or 80s, but it's not. So we should be putting the focus on where the real inequality is. And therefore we could get over these labels like Labour, Tory, Liberal Democrat. They're for them. They're not for us. They're for them. It's for their power. We get rid of that, exposed. They need all the pretend divisions. The Lib Dems traditionally could go into power with anyone, right? Because liberalism, in their view, encapsulates the state superstructure, I suppose. It's not a Nazi state superstructure. It's a power and income state superstructure. If it was Nazi, they'd be gassing Jews, gays, blacks, everyone like that. But it's definitely vastly unequal. And to say it's not Nazi doesn't mean to say it's nice. It means to say it's not completely 100% evil. That's all that means. It's still vastly unequal, it's still Orwellian, it still plays all these games. And you can only get over this ever, not through voting, but by exposing one. It's 98% one. There's no Nazis in it that want to gas people, so it's one. There's no massive difference between any of them. They all wanting to preside over the vastly unequal state superstructure with billionaire owners of news media. There's no Lib Dem saying we shouldn't have that. It's just like a completely one. It's just where it matters, an agreement that there should be a vast state superstructure with vastly different power for us compared to them. Vast megaphone, multinational corporations, news media that can reach millions and nothing for us. And vastly unequal society where to say that someone should only be earning 999,999,000 and then pay 100% tax is almost unheard of. None of them suggest that, because they think there should be billionaires. Now, I did get that from Bernie Sanders, and he was said to be the only politician in America who's advocated it. So he's not going to win that one. Now, so that shows that this vast inequality is where the inequality is. So that's why I suggest we get rid of all them labels that deceive. The issue isn't homophobia anymore. They're not getting prejudice from the top. So that's not the issue. The issue is this: the vast difference of power and wealth and income. It's totally unchanged over the century, because they don't want to change it because they're comfortable. Now, the only way to get for people to see it is to recognise it as one, otherwise they'll keep making these mistakes and going round in circles thinking, oh, if we vote for an anti-establishment party like Le Pen or whatever. But they're not anti-establishment because they play the system. Not blooming Lenin and Yoko Ono, not outside it. So the only way to defeat it is by to recognise it as one. It's when you go to Parliament they're all drinking together. They're not separate rooms. Now, this also damages their narrative if they see it as one, because they don't want you to. They talk about consensus, right? But they don't mean it. Because if they meant it, they would do it, the sort of thing. It's like, it's fake. I think when some of them talk about consensus, they relatively mean it for themselves, but it's a state superstructure consensus that already exists. That sort of thing. That's what I mean. Now, there's some loudmouths within the state superstructure, but it's meaningless. It doesn't mean anything. There's all this stuff that doesn't mean anything all the time. There's a complete consensus that they should have all this power. And the culture wars are a deflection. Brexit's even a deflection. Homophobia is a deflection to a large extent because it doesn't exist anymore, hardly. Everything's a deflection from the point that you don't have power, they do. You can't reach millions, they can. You have to rely on your state pension or whatever, or student loan, they can rely on their millions. And it's just totally like that all the time. As if you could contribute, you wouldn't mind, and people like saying stuff like I am now wouldn't matter. But the state superstructure doesn't exist for many people, it's for a clique. And it needs to be ended because their narrative is game playing. So we need to end their labels. So I'll repeat this, what I said earlier. We should all criticise our own side until there are no sides. So each criticises their own till they see through their own, just like they see through the other. Everyone recognises propaganda in the other, but not in their own. So it's like the global south recognises propaganda about America, but America don't recognise propaganda about America. Britain recognises propaganda about China and Russia, but doesn't recognise propaganda about Britain. Or Democrats recognise propaganda in Republicans, and Republicans recognise propaganda in Democrats, but neither on their own side. But if they did all recognise propaganda with themselves, they'd all be one. But that's the game, it's set up to be like that. So the key is to demolish their labels of Republican and Democrat, Tory and Labour, and then there's no chance of that, because they need it. They need that divisions. If they didn't need them divisions, they wouldn't exist. They're there for them. They're not there for us. Now, it can happen, but even Carl Jung, who was no political radical at all, he stuck to psychology almost 100%. Even he recognised projection from one nation to another, and said you can always see it because their people always support their own nation in a war because they can't see their own nation's propaganda. And he was saying that from a West perspective, like saying we can't see it in ourselves. Now, he wasn't trying to gaslight anyone, he wasn't trying to be political, he was just giving an example of projection, his own psychology. So he didn't, although he goes on and 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 on more than anyone I've ever read, he didn't do that there on politics because he was making a psych point. So he probably went on to more psychology about something else. It was just an example. But you're correct. So even even someone who's as partisan as a wet fart like Carl Jung and not bothered about politics, even he saw it as an example for his psychology. I imagine if any political animals saw that, they might have tried to shoot him down, but I never saw any criticism of it, just an example. So I wrote here, which is worded a bit more strongly than Jung worded his example of that. If one of the nations, China, Russia, America, Britain, accuses the other of being murderous, it's akin to Myra Hindley lecturing Jack the Ripper on the principle of non-violence. So some people can accuse these nations of being murderous. Say if they're a pacifist, they're not being hypocritical. But if a murderous nation lectures them on being murderous, it doesn't really do much for me except expose themselves to me. So they're all one. They're not alien to each other. Now, so we have to explode the narrative. The narrative is all these divided up stuff. And even when they use the word consensus, that just means a consensus within the state superstructure, which they've already got. They just want even more of it, I suppose. So it's difficult overcoming habitual labelling precisely because it's habitual, and that's part of the propaganda. It's meant to be difficult for you to do that. If you ring a bell every time before you're going to give your pet dog food, then eventually when you ring the bell the 12th day running or something, the dog will start knowing it's going to get its dinner. Now, it's similar to that, except on on a high level. I mean, we do ring bells for kids at school, don't we? For dinner. So it works for people as well. Now, but is this labelling the same principle as that? It's to become habitual and fixed in the mind and difficult to get over, just like it'd be difficult for the dog to get over associating the bell with the dog food. But you need to change the narrative in your own head. It can reach others. That's about as far as I've got up to on this anyway. So I always want to say more.